Okay, I think we are live. Hi, my name is Josh Brister, and I'm the host of the Christian Resistance. This is a new podcast discussion forum. Um, right now, I have on the panel SJ, a friend of mine, and Andrew, another friend of mine. What we're going to be discussing today is how to present a full and complete apologetic, a Christian philosophical or apologetic case to an ever growing secular or atheistic culture. That's how what we're going to be discussing. Um, I just want to say thanks to each and every one for being here. Thank you for SJ. Thank you to Andrew for coming on. But I think this is an important topic because you have a lot of um, bold people. Let's call them skeptics or atheists or whatever, saying that the gospel, the claims of Christ, are not relevant in today's culture. And I think there's a number of reasons, a number of insights, just reasons to reject that notion. I think, and I've mentioned this before, that we all live, though, as that God exists. We all live according to natural law and a hierarchy of values. Um, we speak truth, we embody the logos in our everyday language, but you have some people, skeptics, saying that no, um, you know, there's no good reason to live as or to be a Christian, um, to vote that way, to vote with one's worldview, one's faith. And that's what we're going to be getting into today. So I just want a brief introduction, and I'll start with SJ. SJ, can you tell the viewers just basically about yourself and why you think this discussion is important? Why you think it's important to evangelize others? Tell them about the claims of Christ. Why is that important, SJ?
I think it's so important because, as one of my students said, and she was an agnostic and she had encountered some real difficulties in her life. She unfortunately had encountered some very dangerous people who almost killed her in a couple of cases. She had two separate cases of attacks. And she was an agnostic, and she gave me this little bracelet that said, "Let your light so shine." And everyone needs the light you have. That's exactly what the bracelet said. And I thought to myself, that is the reason. If you have the light, you're supposed to be salt and light. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. And you're supposed to not hide the information that you had under a bowl. You have to share it with people. And we have good reason to believe in Christianity that I know we can get into today. We have specific reasons about Jesus Christ. And I think that one of the reasons that some of the people have left the church is sometimes we have to be honest about this. Sometimes it's because our fellow Christians, unfortunately, have mistreated them or misguided them or treated them in a way that's not consistent with how Jesus tells us to live. And so I'd like to especially reach out to those people who've left the church maybe in disgust for some, and maybe some very justified reasons. And I'd like to bring them back into the church, and the church being Jesus Christ. And so just so people know, I'm a professor of business. I teach management courses and leadership and ethics and things like that. I teach cross-cultural communication and human resource management and a lot of different courses. So it's just a lot of fun being a management professor. So, so this is what I do on the side. I found Jesus especially strongly around 2012. And ever since then, I've decided to declare the truth.
Oh, great. That's nice. I'm a former history teacher. Now I'm doing basically a normal, a physical job, actually. I work out in the sun and do a lot of physical labor. And I find that a lot refreshing. I find it, I often think that, people can look down on you because they think you're a failure or something. And I think, no, you can honor God in your work, even if it's physical work. You can worship God that way. There's a number of ways to worship God, but I find a lot of relaxation, a lot of meditation when I'm just focused on physical work. And not just that, I've gotten into a lot better shape, and hope to continue that. But that's just as an aside from what you were talking about. Thank you for sharing that, by the way,
Thank
Andrew.
you.
Andrew, um, now, how the topic is, how do we present a full and complete apologetic case to an ever-growing secular culture? Um, how would you best try to attempt that, to present to like a skeptic or a person that's not sure whether to become a Christian or not? How would you start the conversation in the attempt to provide a full case for Christianity, Christian theism?
Sure. So I've actually been asked this question before and was able to find my notes to my answer. So I've been cheating a little bit. But basically, the first question that one has to ask is what is your fundamental belief about reality, right? Do you believe that reality at the bottom of things is understandable and ordered in such a way that our mind can grasp it? Or do you believe that all the things that we have that we call knowledge are just sort of models that allow us to get about in the world, and that we're always going to be disconnected from the world, and the world is going to be in some sense chaotic and there's going to be no connection there? So basically, this is the question of who do you agree with fundamentally, Plato or Nietzsche? And the answer you give to that will sort of determine the next answer, right? So if you believe that the world is ordered, or that we can actually know things as opposed to just sort of make models, and we don't really know the world, but we can just sort of guess. If you believe knowledge is true, that gets us into sort of the Gospel of John style discussion of things, of what does it mean for things to be understandable, and how does that connect to our reason and things like that. On the other hand, if you're sort of more of this Nietzschean thing of we can't really know how reality is, well, then the answer is pragmatism, basically. And the pragmatic definition of truth is something is true if it's useful, right? And so the fundamental questions that everyone has to answer is, how do you navigate suffering, and how do you aim yourself at what's good? And this is the fundamental question of what it is to lead a good life. And the issue with most of what the secular culture gives is their answer to this is a sort of sophisticated or enlightened hedonism, right? That the way that you aim at the good is through temporal success of money and wealth and fame, and moderate pleasures, right? Mm-hmm. Like the secular world says heroin is bad,
yeah.
but occasionally going out for a drink or doing things just for the pleasure of it is fine, and that's sort of the enlightened part of it, right? That you avoid these things that cause problems, but you still try to maximize your lifetime pleasure.
Yeah.
And the issue with that is, if you're going to suffer in life, as almost everyone does, that's not a real fundamental answer of how do you get through that suffering, how do you deal with it, how do you live a good life regardless of that. And so I think that's sort of the key thing to look at. And Christianity is unique because the central historical event of Christianity is Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And that is That is the answer that Christianity offers, that God suffered and was resurrected, and God can take good, a tremendous good, out of the death and suffering of the perfect man.
Yeah.
And there are other philosophies that you can discuss and look at, but this is sort of the fundamental question, right? Is how are we going to orient our lives, and how do we do it in a complete picture? And this is something that you can reach either way, right? You can go sort of Nietzschean and go for the poetry of it first, or you can go sort of analytically and go from what is the underlying reality. And Christianity is unique in that, and Judaism to some extent does this too, but Christianity is unique because it covers all of this, and it sort of unites both of these parts of the poetry and the analysis together into one coherent system.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. That's great, and you bring up a number of things, so many for me to remember. I think C.S. Lewis talked about true myth, that a lot of these things come together, and you see a lot of similarities or similarities here and there from different religions. But it comes to, in the fullness of time, it comes to its fruition in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So that the resurrection of Jesus, as the central event in Western culture, and I think a lot of theological doctrines have ramifications for how we live our life. SJ, if Christ is risen from the dead, doesn't that show that the material has intrinsic importance, like our bodies have intrinsic importance, and they shouldn't just be disabused? It seems to me that the atheist that believes that, well, do what you want as long as you don't hurt somebody else, is wrong. There's other ways to hurt a person, and when you should treat the body as intrinsically good. Could you pick up on that in any way, SJ?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I loved Andrew's points as well. And I think that there's a few things there. One of them is a lot of atheists will say, why did God kill God for us? It doesn't make sense to them. They're confused about the whole idea. So what was the purpose of why Jesus did what he did? And we have to realize that we were bound to this earth as sin. Our sin bound us to hell, essentially. We were bounded here. And Jesus, through his virtue, and the fact that he's the Passover lamb and the one without blemish, was uniquely capable of freeing us from the binds of our sin. And so why are we bounded in sin is because we've got a corrupt nature. However, like you're saying, we also value things that are sacred. We have within us that we are of importance as we're made in the image of God. We're all men and women made in the image of God, and that is a very important thing. And I think Jesus drew our attention to verses like that, and he also drew our attention to the purpose for his mission in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and Zechariah 12:10, where we find out that he was going to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities and all that kind of stuff. And so we see why he did. But then the question comes in, kind of building off of what Andrew said, is we have these choices, and the choice is to figure out what grounds our morality. And to us as a Christian, we'll say that a morality, objective morality, that we know intrinsically that we need to do what's right, which is consistent with what's morally good, what's right, what's correct, what is truthful, just, ethically sound, all of those kind of things. The fact that we have these intrinsic moral values that call on us to perform and to have duties to do what's right gives us an idea that this must be transcendent to us, because these are transcendent values that transcend generations, time, and people. And so the source of this has to also be transcendent to us. And so the Christian will say the source is God, who's a transcendent being of goodness. He is the goalpost to which we aspire. And the atheist will say the source of the goodness is actually our collective desire for hedonism, or our collective desire for pleasure versus pain. And the problem with the atheist argument on this collective desire idea is, number one, these desires themselves can be corrupt. Someone might collectively, or someone might desire to go rape somebody else. We can tell them that's morally wrong, but if they consider themselves merely animals, how can they possibly say that that's morally wrong? Animals don't consider forcibly copulating to be morally wrong. They're not moral creatures. And so we have a lot of reasons. The other thing is to say that your desire is the grounding is circular reasoning. And so just to say you have this desire is also the source of your desire is kind of silly. And so I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Andrew said, and also just to bring in Jesus. But if people want to know if we have enough reasons to support Jesus's resurrection, even outside of the Bible, we have a ton of evidence that's ancient and true. So,
back to the transcendent, the good, the beautiful, and the true. Those things we all live by. We can all recognize. We can all recognize a sunset is not the mere sum of its chemical, outgrowths, or its chemical reactions, or something of that type. Some things we can know intuitively that there's a source for them that transcends our mere cultural milieu and mere language game of how we talk. That's Wittgenstein. To have any meaning, to give any meaning to language, or to have a meaning of ultimate reality, you must give a source that grounds that reality. That's called metaphysics. And I simply, from all my discussions with skeptics and atheists, I simply do not understand why they don't see that causal connection. I often bring up humility and perception, and how we see things in the electromagnetic spectrum. We only see things. I believe it's between 300 to 400 millimicrons, and we only hear things between 11 to 20,000 hertz. It seems to me that at the level of perception, we have to be humble also, because there are unseen realities that we're not even aware of. So how can we be so dogmatic about the material, about the material universe, when our cognitive and perceptual abilities are limited? So that humility, I think, should make us step back and not be so dogmatic about what is and what can and cannot exist. I often like to share Shakespeare's Hamlet. Shakespeare's Hamlet says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And I think, I think Shakespeare was answering the skeptic in that short-sightedness. And that's, analogous to perception and how I use perception as an argument. Perception should bring a person to humility. Andrew, how do you think trusting in our ability to know, our cognitive abilities and sensory apparatus, how do you think that teaches a person about humility? I know that you use the word, and I think it's a great word. It's a great insight. You use the word phronesis a lot, that practical wisdom that has been gained through hundreds of years, and I think shaped by theology, Christian theology. How would you say phronesis and humility and our cognitive abilities all point towards that ultimate transcendent reality?
Well, sure. Basically, the phronesis, or I'll just use practical wisdom as the English term, is sort of unique in our abilities because it is the only ability that it itself is able to inspect itself. Yeah, so it's sort of our ability to self-reflect. And as such, it's sort of the keystone to us understanding what our purposes are, right? And if you look at just natural theology, we will find out that we're made to love both the world and each other, and we're made to do good and all these other things. And the fundamental issue is that, and this is sort of a contention that often comes up in these debates, is that whether or not our cognitive abilities, if they're functioning properly lead to that practical wisdom, or if we need some way to sort of mitigate and fix it. And sometimes the claim is science mitigates our flawed biases and things like that. And in certain domains and in certain ways it can. But that's the entire thing, is to be able to know the truth of things, we need that sort of wisdom. And you're exactly right, it has been formed, and it does need to be formed by a culture around it. And this is sort of one of the issues that we're running into in the modern world, right? Is that the pop culture isn't even theistic. The pop culture is sort of materialistic or things like that. And so if your local community fails to get you off on the right foot and isn't able to support you, or if you're not able to find one that can help you on your journey to this practical wisdom, you end up getting a bad source. And that's another issue too, right? Everyone can agree that like pop culture gives weird beauty standards, but people don't seem to realize that pop culture is also giving really weird standards of behavior and ethics as well.
Yeah, I think there's well, I think you're pointing at there's a lot of messages that are being communicated in pop culture. A lot of lyrics to these songs, and not just that, but a lot of entertainment in general is fostering this secular mindset. You know, I think I think a person needs to be grounded in philosophy, in phronesis, to really be able to answer the world's questions. SJ, one important question that the world and indeed a lot of students seem to have, or a lot of times they'll say, well, why do you believe Jesus? Truth is relative. Um, what would you say to that person that just tries to find or just says that they're dogmatic? That's just your subjective opinion. You're just given a relative outlook on life. How would you answer the skeptic or the young budding student that has perhaps taken an introduction to philosophy class? How would you answer them?
I think that is actually, they're self-refuting. So if I say all truth is relative, that's actually an absolute statement. So they've just refuted themselves on making an absolute statement. Clearly what's going on is they're not thinking through their propositions. And so I wanted to point out a few things also in what you guys have been saying on phronesis, this idea of the practical wisdom. What's really interesting is in the book of Proverbs, it begins with the idea that the truth is found, all wisdom is found in the fear of God. So the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. God grants wisdom. It says that all through the book of Proverbs. And I was just listening to that today, actually, on my bike ride. So it was fun. But I wanted to point out, like what Jordan Peterson said and what others have noted, is wisdom isn't something that correlates directly with IQ. And so you can find people who have maybe low IQs who have a high level of wisdom and insight about life. And then you might find some people with high IQs that have very low wisdom. And so they don't correlate necessarily. And I think that going into today and kind of building off of this idea of secular truths and what secular people find is true is notice that they're all trying to claim the moral high ground. I noticed that secularists a lot of times are trying to pretend that, hey, I'm more moral than your God. You'll hear people like Matt Dillahunty and other people on those channels, Atheist Experience, saying, I'm more moral than your God. And the interesting thing is that they all know innately, intrinsically through our conscience that we have this innate morality, this desire to do what's right. And so they're trying to claim the high ground and trying to pretend that Christians, who throughout history have always had the moral high ground, are actually in a moral, in some sort of moral depravity based on their views concerning, or based on our views concerning certain things in the Bible. So when we say that God ordained certain things and that, well, they're consistent with the Bible. And so, and I just wanted to point that out. I think Christians still have the moral high ground. And the fact that they're even arguing for a moral high ground suggests that they're arguing for a source of this, which has to be a theistic reason.
Yeah, I think that's the real Achilles heel of atheism. And that's how I think the problem of evil that atheists often present is really the epitome of presumptuousness. It's trying to judge a morally perfect God by the understanding of a fallible human creature. You can't judge a morally perfect God. If God does anything, he's going to have morally sufficient reasons for what he does. You have to ground it in something. So whatever you ground it in, the hierarchy of values that the atheist is implicitly using, that itself would be God. So there is no way for the problem of evil presented by the atheist or the skeptic to get out of this, this logic. It's just a real Achilles heel for the atheist. Andrew, first of all, would you like to pick up anywhere that SJ, or should I move on? Because we're talking about, relativism, and SJ pointed out that when the skeptic or when the student points or says that truth is relative, how that's a self-refuting statement. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. So the way that I like to do it is, if you say truth is relative, right, then what you're saying is the obligation to pursue truth is also relative. So in that case, there's no moral obligation to believe true things anymore. And if that's the case, then what is the difference between truth and error? Right, so that's one way to look at it that I like, because it ties into the objectiveness of truth and morality. Because sometimes people try to split the difference and will say truth is objective but morality isn't, or vice versa. And so that's the other thing. The other one is sort of the classic retortion of, if truth is relative, then the statement truth is relative is relative. And so at that point, you're basically saying nothing. And this is sort of a habit people get into from high school, I think, because it's a really hard argument to refute. Right here, you're basically saying, I'm not going to play the game anymore, and you can't win against someone who refuses to play the game. And that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, it seems like they're playing word games, that Wittgensteinian word games, that all words in all languages are conventional. That is, that they revolve around these word games that we make up. And my response to that is, for us to even understand language, how to speak that, and how Wittgenstein even uttered that, he has to go by something that he takes because of the type of person he is, because of the type of beings we are, people made in the image of God. We can recognize language. Language has real intrinsic meaning, even though there are artificial things we put on language and words and so forth. But for us to have any language at all, and this is what one of Thomas Reid's points, we must have an innate disposition to speak truth. This is something Immanuel Kant and Thomas Reid also said. Not all of this is word games. And not only that, not only do I think the atheist speaks truth or implies or is implicit about truth in communication, but they also, um, you know, testify to the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity. These three basic things are not empirically grounded, but they must be grounded in something that transcends our mere cultural milieu, something that points to something beyond ourselves. Kind of what I'm trying to say is that there's a multiplicity of ways why Christian theism is true. And if Christian theism is true for those multiplicity of ways, there's a multiplicity of reasons why atheism is false. I think every day we live as though God does exist. SJ, concerning the historical evidence for the resurrection, I want to go to that because there's a lot of skepticism today that people tend to think, well, we don't know what the Bible says. It could say anything. How would you answer the skeptic when it comes to the New Testament documents? Let's start with the New Testament documents. How would you answer the skeptic when he says, well, we can't possibly know anything about history? It could have been rewritten like the telephone game. How would you answer such skepticism and concerning the New Testament documents?
I'd go to the person who has organized this whole idea of telephone games and actually read his own words. So take a look at Bart Ehrman and what he actually says, which is outrageous because he first, on one hand, he makes the case that it's a telephone game, we can't rely on it. And on the other hand, out of the other side of his mouth, in his book, Misquoting Jesus, in the appendix, he says that he and Bruce Metzger, who was his Christian advisor, both can come to an agreement that the core tenets of Christianity are well preserved in the New Testament documents. And so the core tenets of Christianity basically are things like Jesus resurrected. There's claims that Jesus resurrected, and those claims are well testified. But if we have to go outside, if the atheist forces us to go outside the Gospels and the epistles and the New Testament, which is really pretty ridiculous because this is, we have eyewitness accounts in there, we have early accounts in there, we have testimonies from people who saw Jesus or who hung around people who saw Jesus. We have all of this kind of stuff in the New Testament, and we have multiple sources. That's, historians want 2 sources. We have at least 9 in the New Testament. And so we have all of this stuff, but if you make us go outside of it, we can go to actually 9 secular hostile sources and also piece together the entire resurrection story. And people like Tacitus and Josephus and Suetonius, Lucian, Celsus, we've got all the kinds of sources that are early within 150 years of Jesus that testify to the resurrection. So even without it, the stones have cried out. Jesus has also, it's interesting because the Old Testament, now, the Old Testament has a number of different passages that point right to Jesus, as I mentioned before, the 3 passages relating to his piercing, but also going to books like Daniel 7, referring to him coming in the clouds of heaven, and Daniel 9, referring to the time when Jesus would be arriving and specifying 77s less 7 after the call to rebuild Jerusalem goes out. And we've traced that down to the week of the Passion Week. And so the reason I'm pointing that out is the Old Testament, here's the stones. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the Dead Sea Scrolls have very well preserved the Old Testament and told all of those silly German scholars that, guess what, you guys are wrong about your claims that the Old Testament is just a mishmash document. Rather, it's been well preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls from a couple hundred years before Jesus even walked the earth.
Yeah, it's amazing. A lot of the skepticism of the Old Testament and New Testament has been, engulfed by archaeological evidence, confirming little pieces here and there, but it's gotten to the point where, a lot of this skepticism pointed at the New Testament, but the Old Testament as well, is just silly. There's really no reason to deny the New Testament is a reliable reliable, set of documents. We have a multiplicity of documents, of eyewitness traditions. I'm thinking of N.T. Wright, and there's some others. N.T. Wright, Mike Licona, Ben Witherington III. There's more. My library's over there. But it seems like a lot of this skepticism is silly. Andrew, how would you reply, just in a blanket way? And you can go into however much detail you want, but how would you reply to a skeptic that's, dubious or, skeptical about the resurrection, and just says, well, miracles miracles can't happen because the laws of physics say they can't? How do you respond to that kind of skepticism, Andrew?
Well, typically you have to do a little bit of teaching on what the laws of physics are, right? And the use of the word law as an analogy for those rules of physics and laws like human laws are actually closer than people realize. The laws of physics describe how physical systems work under certain conditions. They do not actually give a universal description of all possible behaviors, right? And then the other thing is, it doesn't describe what the limits of a being outside of the physical system can do. Just by logically understanding what God is, you should come to the conclusion that miracles are at least possible, right? And then usually I like to discuss what a miracle is, right? A miracle or wonder is a sign of God's providence. I think that's a much better way of describing it than like a violation of the laws of physics.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what the resurrection of Christ is. That's what healings are. That's what even rainbows are, right? They're signs of God's providence.
Yeah.
And they vary in the significance, and but part of it is each person is in a different point, right? That a rainbow to someone who's pious is probably more significant to them than a recollection of a healing that's kept in the tradition or in the Bible, or the vice versa is true too. And I'm not saying that the resurrection is a day-to-day thing, but that's what you have to realize, is these are signs and wonders of God's providence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've often heard skeptics and atheists say that miracles are akin to a judicial rape of nature, of natural law, and they use all this language that's trying to get a rise out of people, but they're short-sighted. Again, as I mentioned earlier about perception, we're limited in the ways we can see things in the electromagnetic spectrum, and how we can hear things. We only hear a small sliver of reality, and we only see a small sliver of reality. So it seems the atheist is presumptuous even at the level of sensible or physical objects. So when you have an act from God creating, directly causing an act in God's natural order that wouldn't come about left to its own devices, it just seems that the atheist is looking at this through a improper lens or an improper worldview. I think if they step back and look at the totality of the evidence, they could see a harmony in why miracles happen. There's always a religio-historical context, and this was specifically with the resurrection, SJ. It didn't just come out of nowhere, but the resurrection of Jesus as a miracle seems to carry with it theological importance and something that he even prophesied about or foretold. Why do you think the resurrection of Jesus, and I know we went through this just a bit with Andrew, but why do you think it plays or is such an important part in human history?
I think Christianity, what Jesus started, plays such an important part of human history, because if we go back far enough and you look at books like Tom Holland's Dominion, you can see that people were pretty awful during the Roman Empire. Life wasn't valued. Women were second-class citizens. A lot of times babies and stuff were left out to rot in the streets because people didn't want to take care of them. And just human life wasn't valued. It was, bring us your dead. It's like that old Monty Python thing. It just wasn't valued. And one of the things that came about that was put into doctrine with our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution is this idea of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we're endowed by our Creator with certain rights. And this goes back to this idea that you guys were both talking about with the moral law. If we have moral laws to do what's right, which we do, to be just, to be kind. I mean, try to tell anybody that we don't have that and let them argue against you, steal their purse or something and tell them again, okay, what'd you say? Well, you don't see that's wrong. It's only, it's your opinion, man. So the truth is there's a moral lawgiver. And so with what Jesus did is he changed the world. He came down here and he had women be the first to discover the empty tomb. He had women lead his church. Phoebe, Junia, we've got women in the New Testament. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because can I share a really quick quote from somebody that I just found on my Christian Apologist blog today?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. So this person named Ben, whoever you are, Ben, I saw what you wrote. It says, he's of course responding to one of my posts. He says, well, of course women are seen as secondhand in the church setting. Haven't you read the Bible? It literally states that women are not to be the head of a church nor lead in matters of discussion. They are actually considered property according to Mosaic laws and aren't counted on the census, much like slaves. That's just biblical history, and one of many reasons I cannot find the Bible nor any flavor of Christianity to be reliable. Now, this person, I just want to point out something. I scoured through the Bible to find out how God wants women to be. And I came to the realization that there is a hierarchy, and it goes like this: Jesus, male, female. That's the deal. And people can try to pretend that it should be some other order. Maybe it should be Jesus, female, male, but that's not how God set it up. God made males stronger, bigger. And so there's a reason why he's got that hierarchy. But he did give women very special roles in the Bible. And we've got comforting, caring roles as people.
And even in the Old Testament, I mean, you have the book of Ruth, Esther, you have books of the Bible written by women or about women. Women play a central role in the Old Testament too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I really think there's without God, and I call this the MVP. Without God, there's no meaning, value, or purpose to anything. So for the atheist or skeptic to complain that, a moral act is wrong, or that genocide is wrong, or that ethnic cleansing, or that racism, or, you can go down the list. Well, you're presuming some natural law standard of ethics, of virtue, that you set your worldview simply can't account for. You're borrowing from a theistic worldview. And to that, we can just say to the atheist that they're welcome. So, okay, Andrew, virtue ethics. Okay, why do you think that the atheist? Well, let me rephrase it. To the skeptic, or to the atheist, or to the radical skeptic, or what have you. When they don't believe in God, what gods do they believe in? What do they do? I tend to believe that we all believe in gods. That the atheist and the skeptic believes in three gods: money, power, and sex. and they idealize those. What do you think, Andrew? Without God, what gods will the skeptic or the atheist believe in?
Sure, and we're using, just so everyone's clear, we're using God in sort of this analogous way of what is the top of the hierarchy of values, right? And so if you don't have transcendent ultimate divine reality, right, what we call God as the top of your hierarchy, you're going to have something else. And oftentimes that's the self or the community or the nation state or an ideology or some goal. And the issue with all those things is they're all temporal and they all fade to dust eventually. And since you have the wrong target, you're going to get it wrong to some extent. And I'll pick on right-wing atheists for the moment, but people that are really vehemently atheistic and right-wing, for example, will tend to either make race and bloodline their idol or the top of the hierarchy, or they'll make liberty the top of their hierarchy and they don't want to be told what to do, or sometimes they'll even make the state the top of the hierarchy. And the top of the hierarchy has to be as close to perfection as you're capable of conceiving of, right? We're all going to get it a little bit wrong because we're imperfect and finite, but it has to be as close to perfect as we can possibly make it to be rightly targeted.
Okay, SJ, and great answer, by the way. SJ, I give you the same answer. When a country, a civilization, or even a person, when they disavow the the so-called, in quote, shackles of religion, to use Rousseau's language, I believe it's Rousseau or Voltaire, when they use that type of language and they say that they no longer believe in God, will they still believe in different certain gods, or aim their worship at different things like the state or radical individualism or money or wealth or power? That's what Thomas Aquinas says, and he talks about, and he uses different words, but money, wealth, and power. What do you think, SJ? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, I agree with what Thomas Aquinas said, and it's kind of similar to what J. Warner Wallace said about why do people do what they do, and that was why he was looking into why did the apostles worship Jesus, even though they knew that they were going to be beaten, stoned, thrown in prison, crucified, all that kind of stuff. He said that the things that guide people are money, sex, and power. And he said that those are the major motivators for people, and the apostles had none of that. But what they did have is they had the power of Jesus. They had the belief, because they knew that they saw the risen Christ, that they were following the truth. And so that's just something. But going back to even building on what you guys have both said, is there's one more to add. I definitely would love to talk a little bit about the evils of communism and how the claims that our social evolution has led us to these wonderful moral values has ignored what happened in the last century, because if we were progressive, then we would be seeing positives in our societies over the years. And we've had more people killed under communist regimes of 120 million or so in the last century, just showing us that these guiding lights that we have of the truth are not guided by social evolution. And the results of social evolution haven't been to improve society. In fact, society's gotten worse on a lot of measures. But I also want to go to the other God that I think is really significant for the atheist, and that is the God of himself or herself, and the sacred self, or the authentic self. A lot of even progressive Christians they say that we need to really embrace our authentic selves. And people like Wayne Dyer say that, and other progressive Christians, and the sacred self and all that kind of stuff. And it's really just worshiping yourself and your own ego. And it's Ayn Rand did that. She's the far right, like Andrew mentioned. We have far right these atheists too. And Ayn Rand is a perfect example of someone who thought egoism is a value to be merited.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about on Ron when you mentioned right wing atheism, Andrew. So great point, great great commentary on that, SJ. But you said you wanted to talk about communism. I think one thing central to communism or socialism is that centralized bureaucracy, have everything be centralized. I think one reason why atheists / skeptics don't or that they want centralization, not decentralization, is because they can directly observe the centralized state. They don't want to look at decentralization, which takes faith in other people, that other people will treat others fairly. Trusting in one's cognitive abilities and sensory perceptions, trusting in our senses and the way we interpret reality, I think is analogous to this mindset that only wants to place trust or of what one can see directly, that centralized, that top-down bureaucracy, and they don't want to place faith in other people, that other people will have fair exchanges with other people and will, let commodities flow on a voluntary basis, but they want to control it all. Okay, what do you have anything to pick up on that, or maybe I wasn't clear? SJ?
Oh, you mean for me? Okay, because I was, Andrew's got to probably speak to this too. No, but I just wanted to say, yes, you were very clear.
I'll go to Andrew next.
What you're saying right there is very consistent with what we're seeing in Europe. And so a lot of people try to say that European countries are operating in this democratic socialism. And basically it's because the Europeans in northern countries such as Sweden pay extremely high levels of tax, personal taxes, income taxes, and also value-added taxes of about 25%. They pay personal income taxes, say on $60,000 of 60%. And their tax money goes in to helps take care of them for daycare. They get K through 12. They get university education if they get accepted to the university in the particular program that's chosen by the state legislatures for them. But I just wanted to point out, so they get a lot of cradle to grave welfare state sort of things. However, it's a very, very tiny society, number one. And number two, they consider themselves free markets. But number three, just to talk to your idea of farming things out, the Swedes and the Norwegians and people who are up in these other countries, the Danes, they like the idea of the government taking care of a lot of the poor people. And so in the United States, in a decentralized system, we farmed out a lot of charities and I'm sorry, we don't farm it out. Charities, churches, all those kind of things step up and help out the poor versus so that's why we're some of the biggest givers in the world versus places such as in Northern Europe where all of this stuff's been farmed out. So they're not directly standing in front of the soup kitchens helping people, handing out stuff. It's a totally different type of environment, and that's what they want. And so the people look at that as if that's some perfect system. They ignore the extremely high taxes, or they ignore the Venezuela experiment, which now you've got well over 80% of Venezuelans starving to death.
Well, you could also point out to, Venezuela, of course, but you could also point out before the USSR experiment and how Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think I'm saying that right, in his 1964, I think it's 63 or 64 lecture when he came to the U.S. and mentioned that the communist leaders just forgot about God. They forgot about God, and that's what the problem was as he saw it. But Andrew, the same question: why do communism states fail? Communism, atheism states fail. Why is that?
And it's an interesting question, right? Because you see the same sorts of failures and aims to rationalize and centralize things in things like the French Revolution. And there's a really weird, and this is sort of amusing and sort of counter what the typical narrative is theism and like epistemic humility are actually friends. And we don't know how everything's working, but God does. And we have to be a little careful not to screw things up. But God is going to take care of us, and so we just have to do what's narrowly in our ability to do. And trying to reform the world is hubris, because God formed it, right? And even the things that we think are bad, or the structures we think are bad, exist for a reason. And so our job is sort of to maintain that and make the occasional incremental improvement.
Yeah.
And that attitude is a lot easier to hold if you realize that there is a God who runs everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A sovereign God, a providential God, that things don't happen by mere accidents, but there's an overarching plan. And indeed, I think we all live as though we have a plan for our lives. We all live on the assumption that we have final ends, that final ends do exist. But when it comes to human history or the cosmos, the atheist throws up their hands and often says that there must not be a plan because of the vast expansiveness of the universe. I think we just lost Andrew. Yeah. Well, Andrew was talking about how we shouldn't just throw out the system which got us here, SJ, and I think that's something that Edmund Burke talked about. That great British British statesman. He actually talked about how we shouldn't just try to make or recreate society and civilization in our own image, because in our own image, it's probably, there's probably going to be numerous flaws and things, unintended consequences that we haven't taken, haven't expressed clearly. History, the long debate of history, is that we got here through providence, a providential reason. And so before we try to remake it, perhaps there's good reasons why we do things, even if we don't have a conscious knowledge of them. I think Jordan Peterson talks about this. Do you have anything to add to that, SJ?
Yeah, you just reminded me what you're saying right here, this idea of trying to remake things and trying to claim that our systems aren't very good systems. I think all of the values and the legal structures that we built in the West are functions of our Christian foundations, and trying to destroy those could honestly destroy us. And there are people right now, and this came about last summer, and I've had this person on my channel called Miklos, forgetting his last name all of a sudden, but Miklos was on my channel, who's like the Jordan Peterson of South America. And he was talking about the Great Reset, which is something that's come out of the World Economic Forum from last summer. And their idea was they were going to capitalize on the terribleness of the coronavirus in order to convince people that now we need to invest all we've got into climate change initiatives. And so the idea is that these mainly rich people who are operating in the World Economic Forum, you have to be pretty much a millionaire to be a member there. You've got the cheapest level is $60,000 a year, which is pretty expensive for most people. So you've got to be a very wealthy person. So you've got some of the wealthiest, strongest, most powerful people in the world operating in the World Economic Forum, saying that sort of they're going to be the climate czars. And they want to reset. They want to change the fundamental foundations of society. And I think that a lot of that is quite demonic, to be honest.
Yeah, it sounds very akin to one world bureaucracy, a politically correct, groupthink type of thing. What groupthink is, just people viewing something in one way, and this politically correct way that tries to control everything. And political correctness is a thing we all have to deal with. The Christian reaction to that is to present the gospel of Jesus Christ in an unembarrassed, it's often politically incorrect way, to say that Jesus is the only way, that Jesus is the answer. If you do not accept Jesus, place your trust in him, then beware, because Jesus talked about hell. He talked about hell more than a lot of things. So, Paul says, with fear and trembling, take this seriously. I'm paraphrasing what Paul says, but the gospel is politically incorrect. And we're about to go, but talk about that. How do you deal with somebody who says, well, we can't talk about Christianity. We can't talk about these hard things in Christianity, like hell and so forth. What do you say with that? My channel, The Christian Resistance, and this is one reason I decided to come back, is to heck with it. Heck with everything. I'm doing one thing, proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. Proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the reason why I exist. And I think that's very important. I think it's a message that our culture needs to hear. And that in my humble channel, I'm trying to do that. But how do you reply to this political correctness that tries to suppress the gospel from even being heard?
I think the political correctness and putting a sugar coating on everything actually supports Christianity even more. And how so? How does that I say that is because if you go back and you look at the Gospels themselves, we've got a lot of really embarrassing testimonies in there. And a lot of people talk about the embarrassing testimonies of when Jesus's brothers tried to stop his ministry. They thought he'd gone crazy. We've got the idea that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. All of these really embarrassing things are revealed in the Gospels and revealed in the New Testament and other places as well. And so we see this kind of stuff out there. And the idea was, if this were not the case and it was supposed to be a sales manual and they were trying to sell it to people, they would have had to sugarcoat it and get rid of all of that stuff. But the fact that we get a realistic preview of the truth, that's it. In my classes, one of the things I teach especially my HR classes, the idea of a realistic job preview. If you go to work for a job, you want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly about that location. You don't want to know just the good or the sugar-coated stuff, because when you go in there in the real world, you're going to encounter the bad and the ugly. And so if you just try to sugarcoat anything in our lives right now without telling us the whole truth and the whole way of God, the way that God has viewed, the way that he has decided, for example, that the family structure of male, female, and child, that family unit is sacred to God. It's very important to God that we're like that. And yeah, sure, that goes against Black Lives Matter and all these people who want to destroy family units, and they want to try to, change around the way people are viewing themselves. They want to do all that kind of stuff. It's going fundamentally against Genesis 1:27. We're all made in God's image, and we're all supposed to value our bodies as sacred, meaning not going into saying sacred self and self-focus, but mainly saying we're vessels of the Lord. And so,
we're temples of the Holy Spirit. That's why the body is important, and we shouldn't do drugs or get drunk all the time or do all these things. We should take care of ourselves. Practice phronesis, that practical wisdom that's rooted in that transcendent reality that holds together everything. So SJ, I want to thank you so much for being here, for doing this. I was hoping actually that there would be some other female apologists, but you represented very well. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Josh. I notice you're making a big splash with these great people you've been having on your channel, so I look forward to listening more. And so anyone who's in here now, if you haven't yet subscribed to Josh's channel, go ahead and hit that button right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Andrew, wherever you are, if you're listening to this, thank you for also being here. And let's carry on the fight, but with love and wisdom. Let's always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have, but let us as Christians be bold. Let us say what sin is. Let us not be scared about saying or preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to an ever-growing secular culture. We're Christians. We may be called names. We may be called every word in the book. We may be everything like that. But let us stand up for the truth. Jesus Christ is the truth, the way, and the life.
Amen.
Let's stand for that. Thank you so much. And everybody have a great night or a great day. It's actually about 1 o'clock. So thank you. God bless everybody. let me end this.